Okay, friends, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started now. Thank you very much again for joining us today. In 1959, W.E.B. Du Bois gave a talk at the Community Church of Boston titled Life in Socialist Lands, Soviet Union and China. He gave that talk after returning from a trip from the Soviet Union and from China. Actually, that talk is up on our YouTube channel if anyone's interested. I share that because we're doing something similar today, where our guest speaker today has returned recently from a trip from Iran, a trip to Iran. So today we're actually continuing a tradition of the Community Church of Boston of having of listening to speakers who are traveling themselves to US adversary countries and coming back and speaking with us. It couldn't come at a more important time right now with current events. So we're going to go ahead and get right into it. Our guest speaker today, Max Blumenthal, is a writer and a journalist. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the Gray Zone News. He's the author of multiple books, including Killing Gaza, The 51-Day War, The Management of Savagery, Goliath, Republican Gomorrah, and so on. He's also he's a documentary film producer and has produced films including Killing Gaza. So, as always, it's a big honor for me to introduce and welcome my friend Max Blumenthal. Max, welcome. Thank you again for joining us.
Great to see you, Amar. Thanks for inviting me and bringing me back to the Community Church of Boston. And it's a real privilege to be able to talk to our virtual congregation here about the trip that I had in Iran, which presaged the Israeli unprovoked assault on Iran, which the U.S. might join at any moment, potentially even during this talk.
When I reached out to you to ask you to speak for us about your trip in Iran, I wanted to book the event in July to give us some time to promote. And you insisted, no, let's do it sooner because I think something big could happen, something could happen. And that very same night, Israel bomb attacked Iran. So I feel fortunate that we're able to hear from you today. Max, to get us started, I've observed over the past few days, in the last week or so, that when people just anecdotally in my life are talking about this situation, they have very different perceptions of what's happening. So for the people listening right now, can you bring us up to speed on, from your perspective, what has actually happened ever since last week when Israel attacked Iran?
Yeah, so many of the narratives we're getting are just false. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I'm not even speaking to the narratives we're getting from mainstream corporate media, which has just been wall to wall packed with neocon voices. The situation is far more dire right now at this point for Israel than we are being told. And it could change at any minute. Israel could pull off some kind of another kind of surprise attack that could alter that dynamic. But right now the situation is dire. And that is why Israel is turning its screws on Donald Trump and increasing the pressure on Trump to authorize direct US military intervention, which Trump thinks will be simply a series of strikes on the Fordo nuclear facility, nuclear reactor. But that's just a means that Netanyahu has contrived to draw the US into an extended conflict, as during the invasion of Iraq, and against a much more powerful adversary. This assault on Iran, an unprovoked assault, because there is simply no nuclear weapons program in Iran, began on Friday the 13th with an Israeli decapitation strike, killing many IRGC leaders. Iran was not prepared, was basically caught with its pants down. It was a huge strategic error on their part. I had been hearing that something was coming, and I mean, I even told Amar, you would think that Iranian intelligence would um, be able to pick something up, but they were not. And so many of its nuclear scientists and IRGC chiefs were simply caught at home. The IRGC Air Force chief, who designed the past two Iranian retaliations against Israel and played a major role in developing their ballistic missile program, was killed in a meeting with much of his staff. And Israel has been recruiting Mossad agents all around Iran, playing on the grievances and desperation of people to recruit saboteurs, using many to establish drone facilities inside Iran. And so much of the damage was done from inside Iran by Mossad agents, Mossad assets. And in the past 48 to 72 hours, many drone facilities inside Iran and Mossad agents have been captured. And these same Mossad agents were active during the women life freedom protests, which were, for many Iranians, not about freedom, but about death. And now it's very clear. Israel carried out attacks in Western Iran with its air force and was mostly using its standoff capacity, launching attacks from Iraq into Iran. And they did do a lot of damage to Iran's anti-aircraft defenses, took out some missile facilities, in addition to these decapitation strikes. The reason I'm spending so much time on describing this attack is it highlights Israel's objectives. There were attacks on the Natanz facility, but these were basically the Natanz nuclear reactor outside Isfahan in Iran, in central Iran. These were symbolic. Israel was unable to penetrate below the surface level facilities. And what Israel's intention was here was really to dismantle the Islamic Republic and to intimidate the entire Iranian public into turning on its leadership or submitting. This is a regime change war, and it is a war against the Iranian people, in which hundreds and hundreds, now it's the death toll is over 300 Iranian civilians killed, may even be higher than that. Well over 1,000 have been injured. Iran retaliated later than expected with a massive volley of mostly older ballistic missiles. And these exposed this saturation salvo exposed Israel's multi-layered, multi-billion dollar air defense system, which US taxpayers have spent heavily on covering, as a paper tiger. And a large percentage of the missiles got through. They were targeted, they were accurate, they hit the Hakiria, the defense ministry of Israel, which is nestled within a civilian neighborhood in North Tel Aviv. This is the nerve center of the Israeli genocide, and beneath it is a luxury bunker and conference room where Netanyahu and the defense military intelligence chiefs have planned every war and genocidal assault. So this was hugely symbolic. And in the days since, Iran has been tapering off its strikes and keeping Israelis pinned down in their bomb shelters. Its strikes have been continually getting through and continuing to strike military targets, intelligence facilities. I can name some of them for you, but also delivering a psychological and physical blow to Israeli civilians in a way they have never experienced, and certainly not since 1973. And it's a civilian population that has celebrated the destruction of Gaza and the extermination of its civilian population. So this is in many ways, and this is in many ways, from the perspective of the resistance, just desserts for what Israel has done. Remember, there were two previous Iranian retaliation strikes, and they were basically sending messages to Israel, True Promise 1 and True Promise 2, sending messages that we can harm you, but we're asking you to just simply chill out, do a ceasefire and stand back. And this time Iran means business because it lost. So many IRGC leaders were killed in addition to Ali Shamkhani, who was the chief negotiator for Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who was offering on the record in an interview with NBC's Richard Engel serious concessions in order to get to a deal, serious concessions in Iran's nuclear program. And they killed him just as Israel assassinated every single Hamas negotiator since October 7th, starting with Salah Arori in his office in Beirut. So Iran means business here. And what they've managed to do is serious for Israel. The Washington Post, citing US and Israeli intelligence officials, has reported that Israel only has about 10 days left, 10 days worth of supplies for its anti-aircraft defenses, which are already failing. Its Iron Dome system is really only effective against much older Hezbollah missiles like Katyusha rockets and the homemade rockets fired from Gaza. The Arrow system has been failing, and Israel's increasingly relying on THAAD missiles from the United States produced by Lockheed Martin, which are extremely expensive. And its air defense system is now costing $285 million a night to operate. And you know who's paying that? You are. We are. Additionally, Israel has suffered over 2 billion shekels worth of damage to its own infrastructure, which is something like $600 million, a massive sum. There's also the lost work for Israelis who are being forced into shelters continually. What Iran is doing is it's firing small salvos of missiles, 3 here, 4 there, 20 at night, to keep people in their shelters. They've openly stated that this is their intention. And Israel is heavily dependent on foreign direct investment for one of its main industries, which sustains its upper middle class, which is tech. And the in direct investment, the investors are fleeing. This is not a stable environment, and it will not be a stable environment. Donald Trump, and I guess we can talk about Trump after the next question more, or further questions, but just to kind of wrap up here, Donald Trump yesterday called on total surrender from Iran to US and Israeli onerous conditions in order for him to hold back on a US strike on Iran. And Iran has sent the message that it will not be sending negotiators to Oman, as Trump demands, and that it will not negotiate under duress, especially when Trump has threatened to kill Iran's leader, which means to me, signals to me that Iran actually believes it has enough strategic depth and political support from its population to continue in a war of attrition. Also means it has enough ballistic missiles in store to continue keeping Israel on its back foot.
So since you brought up Trump, let's talk about that. I heard you earlier today say that in your view, you feel that Trump is he's scared or intimidated somehow by Israel, or he's being manipulated by them. Can you speak more about that and why you said that?
It just seems really strange to see Donald Trump move so quickly, almost out of the blue, reversing previous positions into line with Benjamin Netanyahu. And we all know that Miriam Adelson is Trump's top donor, the widow of the late casino baron and Likudnik warlord Sheldon Adelson, who have donated over $600 million to fuel Trump's career. She was seated behind Donald Trump at his inauguration with a better seat than every member of Congress and most of his cabinet secretaries. But there just seems to be something else about Trump that's hard to explain. And what Trump has not done that really stuns me is he's not even made an attempt to explain this war, why it needs to happen to the American public. There's been no salesmanship at all. You can tell his heart isn't in it. You can tell that he actually doesn't want to do it. He said, "No one knows what I'm going to do today." That's because he doesn't know what he's going to do because he can't figure out which way to go. He's under so much pressure from Netanyahu and the forces and Netanyahu's assets. And I think Trump is actually afraid after withstanding two assassination attempts that if he resists Netanyahu, it could unleash something very dark within the US, something that was briefly unleashed on Barack Obama after Barack Obama's Cairo speech, when the Israel lobby and the Zionist movement actually believed Barack Obama was going to give the Palestinians a state and break out of the dynamic that every other US president had been trapped in. Barack Hussein Obama, who had been friends with Palestinian professors like Rashid Khalidi and known Edward Said. And when two nights after Obama's address in Cairo, I was in Jerusalem and I took a camera down to central Jerusalem where young American Jews get extremely wasted who are studying at yeshivas there. And I went and interviewed them. And one after another, they called for Obama to be assassinated or called him the N word openly with total entitlement, because that's how Obama was being discussed within the Zionist movement, within the Zionist world, in the 5 towns in Long Island where many of these youth were from. My video actually made the local news in New York because these were all New York youth. So the same language would be used about any president who defied Israel. I believe Jeremy Corbyn would have been targeted with some kind of assassination attempt if he had risen to prime minister in the UK. Mike Pompeo, arch Christian Zionist, actually openly threatened Jeremy Corbyn and promised, as CIA director, to push back on him. So there's a real pretext here that I think goes beyond Trump just being bought and bossed. And Trump feels like he's in a corner. He's extremely mentally lazy, does not understand the nuclear issue very well, nor does his top negotiator, Steve Witkoff, who's overwhelmed and who, I mean, I'll talk about my trip to Iran, but I got to speak to Iranian diplomats who are very close to the negotiations, and they were mystified by Trump's behavior. Were actually asking me for some insight because they couldn't understand what made Trump tick. And I think they weren't able to believe that someone so mentally lazy and easily manipulated could be elected, who was seen as such a great deal maker and businessman, and they thought he was playing some kind of 5D chess with them. So now we're at a point where the contradictions of America First are coming out, and Trump is actually backstabbing, or no, he's front stabbing and throwing under the bus some of his most loyal intelligence chieftain, Tulsi Gabbard, director of national intelligence, who changed parties to endorse him because simply because she did what every other director of national intelligence did before her, which is to assess in the national intelligence estimate last March that Iran was not producing a nuclear weapon. And Trump has insulted one of the intellectual authors of America First, Tucker Carlson, calling him a kook and telling him to go get his own TV network because Tucker is waging a heroic campaign from within conservative circles to rally opposition to this US war for Israel. It defies everything that America First is about because the US president, who is the vehicle for America First, is letting a foreign leader tell him which country to attack. And there seems to be no US national security interest there. If anything, Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has already admitted that Israel is a hindrance and threat to US national security by declaring, after Israel's unprovoked assault last Friday the 13th, that the US had nothing to do with this and that Iran should not attack US assets, basically implying that Israel's actions are getting US soldiers and US assets and US diplomats in the region uh, are putting targets on their back. So this is an important dynamic, the intellectual political battle that's taking place within the grassroots of the Republican Party. And the sense that I'm getting just from communicating with some of these figures on the periphery is that they feel they just feel this deep sense of shame. They helped get Trump elected, and now a foreign leader comes along and just takes control of the person that they had volunteered so much of their energy and resources for. Even Steve Bannon is condemning this as a war for Israel and joining Tucker Carlson. Steve Bannon co-founded Breitbart, which was one of the most ultra-Zionist publications in America, was constantly attacking me, was manufacturing consent for a war on Iran for years. And Steve Bannon has now done a kind of 180. It's really amazing to see. So I think we're witnessing a sea change. Many of you who are in anti-war circles, you're more on the left, you're more associated with progressive movements, have seen the sea change within the Democratic grassroots base. But now it's happening within the Republican base. And pretty much every Republican under 45 is opposed to this war. Most Americans are opposed to this war. So if Trump goes to war for Netanyahu, the mask is completely off, and we're not going to experience the same kind of honeymoon. We're not going to witness the same kind of honeymoon that George W. Bush got after he invaded Iraq. There's just going to be opposition from all points inside the United States and globally. The only country that wants this war is Israel. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, the historic antagonists, regional antagonists of Iran, do not want it. It will destroy their economies too and destabilize their societies too, to the extent they even have societies. It's Israel alone, and now Trump is alone almost within his own movement.
Yeah, and to support your point, again, anecdotally, but my conservative friends and training partners, they don't support this war either.
No. No, I went down to the military parade, which was supposed to be the Army's 250th anniversary. It was really kind of like military propaganda, recruitment propaganda, and Trumpist quasi-fascism. And I went up to talk to every person I saw wearing a MAGA hat there, the red MAGA hats, to ask them, do you support a US war for Israel on Iran? And I couldn't get any of them to answer in the affirmative or be enthusiastic about it. But many of them would said, well, we should just maybe we should just be do a precision strike or whatever the president says is right, but none of them were into it. And most of them were deeply opposed to it. I mean, that's anecdotal, but we can look at polls. The YouGov Economist poll shows only 19% of the American public supports this, and it's consistent across all racial and party and lines. The only group that's slightly more supportive is older Republicans, but only by a small margin. And a Pew poll is consistent with the YouGov poll. So there's just nothing showing any support for it, but Trump's going ahead anyway. So we have to really ask, who's in charge here? Is Netanyahu the president of the United States?
And it's a test for people who call themselves America first when the president is acting clearly like Israel first.
Yeah, that's it's MIGA. It's make Israel great again, except it's not making Israel great. And many Israelis uh, might support the war but are opposed to Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not particularly popular there. It's causing enormous damage to their society, as I said, economically, physically. And if Netanyahu had simply wanted to get the hostages out of Gaza, he could have made a deal months ago. Of course, I've been blaming Trump the whole time, but we need to consider that Kamala Harris declared Iran to be the number one threat to the United States and
Right.
wonder what she would have done in this situation. And if Biden and Blinken and Brett McGurk, the people who really controlled Biden's foreign policy, had pressured Netanyahu at all for a deal over Gaza, we first of all, we wouldn't be witnessing the horrific and satanic scenes out of Gaza where people are being slaughtered for a bag of flour. Gaza Health Ministry reports over 120 people were killed in the last 24 hours. But we also wouldn't be in this dynamic where the US is being pushed by Netanyahu to bomb Iran. It wouldn't be on the table at this point. So Netanyahu, he needed to keep the Gaza genocide going for a variety of reasons. Some of them pertaining to his own career, some pertaining to his own objectives there. But if he had not kept it going with Israeli troops constantly in combat inside Gaza, there wouldn't have been the momentum for an assault on Iran. And Biden let that take place. So the Democrats are responsible here. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic minority leader, the only statement he's made is to criticize Donald Trump about a week ago for attempting to, or a little more than a week ago, for attempting to make a side deal with Iran. In other words, for being too amenable to diplomacy. Chuck Schumer attacked Trump from the neocon right. And where are the Democrats right now? The only real strong opposition we're hearing about this has been from Marjorie Taylor Greene and the America First members of Congress. Finally, we're seeing some opposition with Tim Kaine introducing a war powers resolution. AOC has just announced that she will sign on. And it's Thomas Massie, the libertarian congressman from Kentucky, who's really pushing this in the House. But most of this is really coming from within America First. There haven't been many protests that I've seen yet. And it's time to really get active.
Can you explain to our audience what is the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and what role, if any, they had in providing intelligence to the United States or Israel that was used to attack Iran?
The IAEA has played a disgraceful role. It operates under the auspices of the United Nations, and it's responsible for inspecting the nuclear facilities and um, countries of signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which includes Iran. And the IAEA is basically, because of that role that it plays, it's a target for US and Israeli influence. And its current Secretary General, Rafael Grossi, was brought to power after his uh, predecessor died sort of mysteriously, who was too rigorously attempting to resist Israeli pressure. Grossi came in with support from the US, support from Israel, and Iran leaked some documents it claimed to have obtained through an intelligence coup in Israel, showing that Grossi was actually coordinating with Israeli IAEA officials on his way towards becoming Secretary General. So just about 48 hours before Israel attacked Iran, the IAEA introduced a disgraceful resolution declaring that Iran was not in compliance with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if you actually read the text of it and know the details, many of them the allegations date back to 2003 and are the products of Israeli fabrications about Iran's nuclear program that were just simply recycled from past attempts to get the US to intervene or to shatter the JCPOA the US signed in 2015. So why recycle all these past allegations at a time like this when Israel was threatening to strike? And let's look even more closely at that timeline. The resolution was, I think, introduced on June 11th or June 10th. Okay, on April 12th, Donald Trump sent a letter to Iran's leader, Khamenei, offer, calling for negotiations on the nuclear issue. And he said, I am going to give you a 2 month timeline. And if you don't accept this timeline and we don't make a deal by then, there will be a war. This has been widely reported. It's on the public record now. Right before the timeline expired, the 60 days or so expired, Netanyahu went to Trump and asked Trump to green light an Israeli attack and use the timeline to pressure Trump and said, look, they haven't made a deal by this point. Let me just do it. And Trump lazily shrugged and said, okay, even though that Sunday there were negotiations planned. I assume that Netanyahu went to Trump not only because of the timeline, but also because of the IAEA resolution accusing Iran of violating the NPT. And it looks like coordination. And beyond that, okay, on Friday the 13th, Israel killed 9 more Iranian nuclear scientists. Israel has been assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists for years. I went to the tomb, the shrine to Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who is considered the Oppenheimer of Iran, in the Tajrish, at a shrine in Tajrish in North Tehran. And he's just a revered figure who was killed by the Mossad after they shipped in a remote controlled machine gun into Iran and they attacked his convoy. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh's name first appeared as a target in a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation given the year prior by Netanyahu, who accused him of developing nuclear weapons and so forth. How did Netanyahu get Fakhrizadeh's name? It happened right after Rafael Grossi became Secretary General. And Iran, after obtaining all these nuclear documents from Israel in this intelligence coup, claims that the IAEA was supplying Israel with the names of nuclear inspectors. Not nuclear inspectors, top nuclear scientists. And their names are kept secret because of the threat they face. Um, I actually met the son of Iran's top quantum theorist who was shot dead in his front lawn when this guy was 14 years old. He told me about it. So this has been happening for years. And Iran believes the IAEA is actually colluding with Israel to get their nuclear scientists killed. This is a scandal, a titanic scandal of historic proportions. And the story hasn't really been told to the US, to US citizens yet. But what it will lead to, this disgraceful, perfidious behavior by the IAEA, is Iran leaving the NPT and ultimately developing a nuclear weapon in order to survive as a nation.
You've made the point, and others have made the point as well, that in your view, and also in my view, that these attacks on Iran aren't about stopping the nuclear program, whatever that may be, but it's about regime change in Iran. For
Yeah.
people who doubt that, could you elaborate more on that, why you said that?
Because of the nature of the Israeli strike in the beginning, that they're attempting to grind down the leadership by killing them, because of Netanyahu's language about Iran, because of and ultimately it all goes back to the sort of the logic of Zionism, the destabilizing logic of Zionism. Israel cannot allow any country to exist in the region that resists its project, its settler colonial project of occupation and the maintenance of an ethno-supremacist state at the expense of the Palestinians. And so they've been working to, starting on October 7th, they've been working to destroy every member of the axis of resistance until they get to Iran, which they consider the base of resistance. And the resistance comes from the Islamic Revolution of 1979, when Iranians decided they were not going to be allied with Israel and the United States anymore. And they were going to adopt the slogan of freedom, independence, and Islam, which comes with solidarity with the Palestinians. Iran, with its powerful military, but also its deep wellspring of social solidarity, political solidarity with the Palestinians has to be destroyed in order to maintain a Jewish supremacist state on the backs of Palestinians. And if Iran were to theoretically develop a nuclear weapon, what it would what would be the consequences for Israel? Iran would not immediately seek to attack and destroy Israel. There's nothing indicating that they would do something like that, that would potentially sacrifice their own stability, put them under an existential threat like the one they're facing now. What they would do is they would use that nuclear weapon to establish a protective umbrella for the oppressed people of the region, from Yemen to Palestine to Iraq to Lebanon. And Israel would find it difficult to continue occupying these people and terrorizing these people without facing a real existential threat itself, which would then lead to the demographic demise of the Jewish Israeli public. A brain drain, large parts of segments of the Israeli public would begin to leave, and the settler movement itself would become suffocated and would turn internally on the part of the Israeli public that opposes it. This is the kind of dynamic the contradictions of Zionism would explode into the open if Iran obtained a nuclear weapon, which is why Israel cannot allow Iran to be a latent nuclear power. But in order to prevent Iran from having a nuclear program, Israel needs to enact regime change, because there is simply no Iranian government under the current circumstances that would give up its civilian nuclear program. That's something that became abundantly clear to me after I visited the civilian nuclear reactor in Tehran and talked to people associated with loosely associated with the program.
Yeah, and if regime change in Iran were to happen, or attempted regime change in Iran were to happen, that just incentivizes Iran even more to have a nuclear weapon. If the goal is for Iran not to have a nuclear weapon, the way to do that is through diplomacy and negotiation. They have to do it voluntarily, not by force.
I mean, I can tell you just from talking to Iranian diplomats, like high level diplomats, they are eager to make a deal. They are willing to make sacrifices in their program in exchange for sanctions relief, and being out in the streets in Iran, being in private homes, interacting. I interacted with a very diverse array of Iranians from across social strata with different perspectives, and all of them are suffering under sanctions. They all want sanctions relief. So Iranian leadership wants this deal. They don't want to develop a nuclear weapon and go to the brink. And there is a fatwa issued by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei against against developing a nuclear weapon that's still currently in effect. But we also have to remember Iran has a civilian nuclear program. It's being used to develop medical products, including radioisotopes that treat 1 million Iranians. They're under sanctions, so they can't import these kinds of goods. For example, if you've ever had cancer, you've been treated for cancer, and you need to get tested, you get a PET scan. That's the most reliable way of detecting cancer. Iran's doing that through its nuclear program. It's treating agricultural products through its nuclear program to prevent infestation from insects. It's using it to disinfect medical devices. It is also seeking to develop and diversify its electrical grid, its power supply, because they've been having, blackouts every day for an hour or two. Its population's growing rapidly. And the nuclear program makes them a regional power that can export technology. They're training thousands and thousands of nuclear scientists. It's part of their national identity and pride. But it didn't begin under the Islamic Republic or after the Islamic Revolution. It actually began first with the Atoms for Peace program, which was launched by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in the US, which gave nuclear know-how and technology to the government or monarchy of Shah Reza Pahlavi. And Shah Reza Pahlavi was the one who developed the nuclear reactor I visited in Tehran with American and French assistance. After the Islamic Republic came into being, the Americans and French quit and they had to turn to Russia for assistance. And now they're mining uranium domestically, and they're able to do this all domestically under sanctions. They're not going to give it up. They're just simply not going to give it up. But what they are going to do is they are going to abide by their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to not produce a nuclear weapon. They would do that. But what the US has been demanding since negotiations began is no enrichment at all, that they just blow up all of these facilities they've been building that even the Shah wanted to develop. And that is a step towards capitulation. And when you give an inch, this is much more than an inch, but when you give much more, if you when you give an inch to the Zionist axis of Israel and the US, they're going to take a mile. As we saw with Muammar Gaddafi, who gave up his non-conventional weapons, his sources of deterrence, in a deal with negotiated by one of the biggest reptilian shape-shifting sleazeballs on the planet, Tony Blair. And what did they do to Muammar Gaddafi? Destroyed him, launched a completely, basically unprovoked regime change war that led to him being sodomized to death with a bayonet by Al Qaeda mercenaries operating under NATO air cover. Uh, in contrast, the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, developed nuclear weapons, developed a ballistic missile system to deliver them, and got love letters from Donald Trump. And Donald Trump walking across the demilitarized zone to meet him to discuss a deal. So that's the lesson for the world. And Iran, at the very least, is going to insist on nuclear rights under international law.
Even though Netanyahu's been saying for many years actually that Iran is close to having a nuclear weapon, they're months away, they're weeks away, whatever. That's proven not to be the case. And as you just mentioned earlier, the Supreme Leader issued a fatwa saying nuclear weapons are against Islam. People like you and others, people who are very familiar with this issue and have studied it very closely, have been making the case for a long time that Iran doesn't want nuclear weapons. That the US media that says Iran wants nuclear weapons, that's propaganda. However, when Israel talks about the Libya option, which you just alluded
Yeah,
to, isn't the Israel and the US driving Iran into nuclear weapons? Wanting nuclear weapons?
well,
What other choice
completely.
would Iran have if the other option is the Libya option where Muammar Gaddafi got sodomized to death on live TV for giving up his weapons program?
Completely. And apologies to everyone for the interrogation lighting. Uh, I'm not at I'm not in my usual studio right now, and I lost daylight. But I mean, completely. I mean, I think I answered that question with my previous comments. But I would think that the logical thing for Iran to do would be to produce a nuclear weapon and call it a day. But it's just simply not that easy when you're under military assault as they are now. They developed a nuclear weapon, tested it, and declared it. The the US would have to decide, do we attack and potentially surrender Israel to a nuclear assault that could kill 500,000 people? Or do we just negotiate with them on their terms? And I think a rational leadership would do the same thing that was done with North Korea, the same, or treat Iran like Pakistan, which has a nuclear weapon, which it obtained not exactly through cooperative means. The other issue is why Israel is allowed to have anywhere between 200 and 400 nuclear warheads, which it could deliver not only to Iran, but across Western Europe, initiating the Samson option, which Seymour Hersh exposed in the early 70s and Mordechai Vanunu exposed, the great Israeli whistleblower who was tortured for years by Israel for blowing the whistle on the Dimona facility. I think the bottom line is either there is a nuclear free Middle East or nuclear free West Asia, whatever you want to call it, or Iran has the right and the necessity to develop a nuclear weapon to defend itself from the most destabilizing force on the planet, which is Israel and its American backers.
Yeah. If this war keeps escalating and if uh, Israel feels more vulnerable or threatened, what is the likelihood that they will use a nuclear weapon?
The question is, can they execute a nuclear strike? And what and will that lead to the final diplomatic demise of Israel? Are they willing to do that? That's one question. The other question is, will it get to that point? And I don't think this war will take Israel to that point. And I don't think Israel will allow it to. This will be a war of attrition, and the dynamic that we're witnessing right now will continue to play out over the coming days and possibly coming weeks. I'm not sure how the United States can alter the dynamic by entering the conflict, but I do think that they are militarily underestimating Iran and also underestimating Iranian society. There's been a rally around the flag effect inside Iran. Young Iranians who are frustrated with the Islamic Republic are now seeing their neighbors and friends and families get killed in Israeli airstrikes backed by the US. They're hearing Trump's rhetoric, and they might have wondered why their parents called America the Great Satan. They didn't live through the Iran-Iraq War, and now they're seeing it. And they're being called to evacuate their homes at 3 a.m. before they're bombed. They might not, and there's communication blackouts. They're being subjected to a process of Gazification in Tehran. And this is something that, I'm telling you based on conversations with young Iranians that I've been having and colleagues of people I got to know there. So the hope for regime change seems delusional at this point, as does the hope for just toppling the government through military force. But I also don't think that Iran has the capacity or intention to bring Israel in the near term to a point where it seeks to enact a nuclear strike. But I do think that Israel is the greatest nuclear threat on the planet. And we've seen what they were willing to do to Gaza. They have dropped the equivalent of 6 nuclear bombs on Gaza. They will do that, not just to an adversary, but to a frenemy in Europe that betrays them. I truly believe that.
Wow. Okay. So, uh, um, I had a question here, but it slipped my head. I'll
Questions from the audience or
I'll read you a question from one of our church members. Ed and Beer wrote in this question. So I'm going to read a question from Ed. Ed, thank you for sending this question. Community church member Ed wrote, quote, Israel has bombed Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, Iran, and Yemen in the last year and continues to not be held accountable by the United Nations and its affiliates as a terror state. Can a vote from the General Assembly of the UN censure Israel in some way, such as losing its vote at the UN, being financially sanctioned, and having Israel account for its nuclear stockpile? If Iran cannot have nuclear weapons, why should Israel making why should Israel?
well, ideally, what should take place is Israel's ejected from the United Nations uh, for the behavior displayed by its UN rep Gilad Erdan, who's consistently threatening the United Nations, and Israel is consistently killing United Nations personnel, attacking the UNRWA in Gaza. but mainly for killing so many UN staffers, as well as just waging a global campaign to discredit the UN. It should be ejected from the UN. Israel should be sanctioned by the United Nations, and the United Nations should revive its 1975 resolution declaring Zionism to be a form of racism, to sanction Zionism as an ideology and place it on par with Nazism. But that's not going to happen because the United Nations, like the IAEA, was unfortunately placed in New York City in a building built by the Rockefellers. And the collective West, over about 55 countries, tends to vote with the United States no matter what. We've seen that on Ukraine. So don't really see any of this, any resolutions that will actually alter the calculus of Israel taking place at this point.
What is Israel's strategy by attacking Iran? They want the US to come in and support Israel in destroying Iran. And what is the likelihood of that happening? And what does Israel do if that doesn't happen?
Netanyahu's dream, his objective, his entire life mission has been to get the US to fight a war for Israel against Iran. That's how he wants to close out his life. And this is Netanyahu's closing act. He just had a major, late last year, a major operation. And you can look at him, you can see that he's a very stoic figure. He has a lot of energy and fortitude for someone his age, but he's on his last. He could be on his last legs here, and so this is a closing act for Netanyahu. And the strategy or the calculus for Netanyahu initiating this unprovoked surprise attack on Iran last Friday was that he knew that he may not have been able to finish this war, but he felt very, very confident that Donald Trump would have to enter the war. And Netanyahu descended into a luxury bunker. Many Israeli officials have gone off to Greece. Uh, and an order has been issued to prevent Israelis from leaving the country. Maybe some affluent Israelis now are taking boats to Cyprus, but they're all being kept there as human shields, the fodder of Zion, to die and suffer and go in bomb shelters. And they're going to be used as worthy victims to be projected to the American public to put more pressure on Donald Trump to intervene, along with all the other factors I described before. Netanyahu felt so confident going in that the US would intervene. That's what informed his decision. And it's very likely to happen. It could happen at any moment. Everything I'm hearing around Washington, around the White House, is that Trump is very likely to do this with absolutely no support from the American public and negligible support from his own base, and even in his own administration, uh, deep opposition from his own intelligence officials.
When I read, I haven't had much time to follow the mainstream media, the corporate media over the last week, ever since all of this started escalating. But the few headlines I caught, they're making it, the impression that I'm getting from the headlines is that Israel is inflicting massive damage on Iran. Iran is cowering. Iran is afraid. Trump himself is making very bellicose threats, basically, against Iran. However, when you and others, many of your colleagues, many military people, retired military people, when they comment about the air defense of Israel, that they're running out, not just Israel's running out, the US is running out, the US is going to have trouble supplying them. These are like two very competing, very different narratives. So, I don't know, could you just talk about that more for people who are more familiar with the mainstream narrative and why that's not as reliable in your opinion?
Well, Iran has a much higher pain tolerance than Israel. Israeli society is not accustomed to this uh, level of shell shock. and they are accustomed to a first world standard of living amid, a villa in the jungle is how the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak put it. That's what Israel's going to be experiencing. So psychologically, Iran has the upper hand. Militarily, Iran's military is mostly developed domestically. It's air defense systems. I produced a video from inside Iran's aerospace park, which where they showcase their drone program, their ballistic missile program, their anti-aircraft defenses, and their space program. They have a completely indigenous space program that has put 4 satellites in space. It's all taken place under sanctions, whereas Israel has the technological advantage over almost every military in the world with the amount of support it gets from the United States and Europe. Um, so we have to acknowledge that. But when we're told Israel controls Iranian skies, I've been talking to Iranian friends who've told me that Israeli jets haven't gone further than Western Iran. They're not circling Tehran like they are Gaza City. The main sources of damage have been internal Mossad penetration, Mossad saboteurs inside Iran, and then Israel using its standoff capacity from Iraq. And many Israeli projectiles are being intercepted by Iran's aircraft defenses, anti-aircraft defenses. I'm seeing the Iranian anti-aircraft systems do saturation attacks on Israeli projectiles, which suggests that they are not depleted and that they're still very active. And, just in calls and interviews with Iranian colleagues, I hear it going off all the time. There have been many projectiles taken down. Israel's anti-aircraft system are multi-layered. It's the most advanced in the world. And a new video just surfaced of an Indian like merchant marine crew off the coast of Israel filming an Iranian missile strike. And you can see the arrow system misfiring. This keeps happening. The arrow system goes up and then comes down and actually strikes Israeli cities. And then 2 missiles actually get through and make impact in Tel Aviv. That took place last night. And last night, Israel announced that those missiles had all been intercepted. So they're lying to us. And there is an information blackout from Israel. Foreign journalists are all being arrested for filming from rooftops. Israeli citizens are being arrested and punished for filming missile strikes. There is a resolution coming in the Knesset to criminalize celebrating Iranian missile strikes. The security coming from the psychotic security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And the information blackout is making it actually harder for us to exactly know what's going on. But the damage is much more comprehensive and more focused on important military and intelligence centers than we are being told. Like, for example, the Weizmann Institute, named for Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, who is a chemist. Look up the Weizmann Institute. It is Israel's main center of research on its nuclear program, on its drone program, on AI. It was totally destroyed by Iranian ballistic missiles. So, yeah, Iran suffered devastating attacks on the first day. It continues to get hit. The pain tolerance there is higher, and Israel's getting hit in a way it has not before. So I think the key question is how much does Iran have left, and will it be able to redirect those missiles if the U.S. enters in order to target U.S. assets?
This event was, we had scheduled it for an hour, so we've just about hit our time. I'm going to ask maybe 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up.
Right.
So, the United States could not defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example. The Taliban are in charge in Afghanistan. They couldn't stop the Houthis, the Ansar Allah, from blockading the Bab el-Mandeb Strait or the Red Sea from ships coming and going from Israel. What makes them, how could the US go to war with Iran, which is much bigger, both in terms of population and geography?
Yeah, the U.S. almost lost an aircraft carrier against Ansar Allah or the Houthis. It lost 3 extremely expensive jets. think, was it three F-18? Uh, one of them fell off the Eisenhower because it made a sharp right turn to evade a Houthi attack. And then Trump said, "Oh, they're very brave, courageous fighters," and he just bowed out suddenly. Iran's, I should mention, the IRGC has done 90% of the attacking, maybe 95%. The Iranian armed forces are separate from the IRGC, and they have only just gotten involved. And Iran has an effective navy and it has standoff capacity. So it can do much more damage to US naval assets like the Ford carrier battle group, which is just entering the Persian Gulf, or what Trump calls the Arabian Gulf. And so you're right. What uh why is Trump risking the lives of US sailors and US Army personnel, the US bases in the region, for a psychotic little apartheid state? It just doesn't make sense to anyone. And it doesn't make sense to people. It doesn't make sense to people in the US military. It doesn't make sense to America First influencers. So what happens? Let's say what would happen if a carrier went down? I don't think that's likely, but what would happen if more US jets were taken down? Iran has intercepted several US drones. I actually visited a Hawkeye naval drone. I saw it in the aerospace park. Iran has reverse engineered many of its drones based on US drones it's taken down. What if they capture a US pilot? What if they kill US soldiers at a base? The US just evacuated the Al Udeid base, the head of the snake in Qatar today. How does the US public respond? Do they want revenge? Do they bray for the blood of Iranians? Or do they say, "This is crazy, we're dying for Israel"? And I actually think that it will be the latter. So Donald Trump really risks destroying his presidency here. Iran has it should not be underestimated.
I'll ask two more questions and then we'll give you, Max, the floor for any closing remarks. You've, over the course of the discussion tonight, you've referenced your trip to Iran and used it to inform your analysis about what's happening. Can you share with us anything you might not have mentioned about your trip to Iran that you would like to, especially in regards to the people you met?
Well, one thing I haven't mentioned is you see all this propaganda now about how Iran forces women to wear the hijab and it's so oppressive, and that's why we have to basically kill all those women and bomb them. This was a point made by a Iranian expat panelist on The View today. It's like, you know, low IQ propaganda mechanism that's probably more effective than every one episode of that is more effective in brainwashing the public than everything I've done for my whole life to try to wake them up. But you don't see the hijab being enforced in Iranian cities. You just don't see it. Now, it's true, women have to be ready to put it on, but you'll see women everywhere just not wearing hijab. At night, you can actually see women going out in like tank tops into hotels with their hair out, not even, with a scarf ready. And the state has basically, it seems like the state has decided not to enforce it in order to reduce the tension between the secular public and the religious public. And it's still an issue, but it's become less of an issue. And I filmed like a walking tour of a really beautiful uh, uh, village or town just north of Tehran at the base of Mount Tochal called Darban. It's on Twitter. I can have Amar share it with you, and you'll just see me walking through this small street in a village, or this narrow street in a village, and everyone's out enjoying their Friday night or Saturday night, and very few of the women are even wearing hijab there. Like they're in the minority. So this is something I think people don't understand in the US. Anyone watching this, just go on YouTube when this is over and type in the search bar walking tour Tehran. And there are tons of videos from inside shopping malls and streets in Tehran. And you'll see what it really looks like or looked like before this war. And so my takeaway from that was that if the United States had just left Iran alone, a process of reform would take place naturally. Liberalization was taking place naturally, but within the context and the parameters of the Islamic Republic, which prioritizes independence from collective Western dictates and uh, freedom also from the IMF. Iran doesn't have debt like other countries. And Islam. They are going to have a clerical leadership, but there was a process of liberalization that's been taking place somewhat quietly, but it's happening. And this war, I think, threatens to reverse that.
The last question I'll ask before giving you the floor for closing remarks, Max, is, and also before that, I just want to say also thank you everyone so much for joining us, and also my apologies for not being able to get to every question. Max, with the situation escalating between Iran and Israel, where does that leave Gaza right now? What's the situation like in Gaza currently?
I wanted to make one other point on the last question. I also got to engage with the Jewish community in Iran, and it needs it needs to be understood, and there needs to be a spotlight on the Jewish community in Iran to counter Netanyahu's propaganda about how Iran is anti-Semitic and wants to commit another Holocaust. Because the Jewish community in Iran is the second largest Jewish community in the region. There are 10,000 of them, and they are protected officially under the Constitution of the Islamic Republic. They live in safety. They are not freaking out about anti-Semitism like American Jews are, or American Jews morally depraved institutional leadership. Uh, and their official leadership is anti-Zionist and draws a sharp distinction between Zionism and Judaism because it's Zionism that places them in the crosshairs and makes them an object of suspicion, and they recognize that. And they're practicing Judaism in a very uh, traditional way, in an indigenous way. One of my last in one of my last days there, I went 40 minutes outside Isfahan to a ninth century Jewish cemetery and saw Jews pay respect and pray for their relatives who are buried there because it's a still active ninth century Jewish cemetery, which is located next to a shrine for Serat Bat Asher, who was said to have been at this location with her grandfather, Jacob, Jacob from the Bible, as they waited for Joseph to arrive from exile. And that Judaism is still alive in Iran. This is also something Zionism seeks to snuff out. So I think that needs to be recognized. And Zionism is snuffing out the entire reputation of Judaism and turning the symbols that I saw on those graves there, symbol of my faith community, they're turning it into a swastika. And so one way to resist it is to recognize that there are these other communities out there that are operating completely outside the control of Zionism. And one of them is in Iran. Gaza is being taken off the internet, the radar of the media, but the media was basically ignoring it anyway at one of its most horrific stages. At the same time, what Iran is doing is relieving pressure on the resistance in Gaza, and you can see the resistance factions are mounting some pretty serious operations after almost 2 years of war. And Israeli soldiers are constantly being medevaced out of Gaza or taken out in coffins day after day as Israel has to reallocate resources. Israel's reservist corps are exhausted. A lot of men are not showing up. And the part of the population that participates in the military is uh, is psychologically exhausted. But the one of the biggest scandals of our time is not getting the attention it deserves right now, and it's the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is being used, is funded by Israeli intelligence and the Israeli Defense Ministry, fronted by American officials, including Trump loyalists, and they're hiring mercenaries through firms like Safe Reach Solutions, which is actually run by a former CIA operative named Philip Riley, who doesn't live that far from me in the DC area. And these figures are true villains, true criminals, and they're not getting the negative attention they deserve. What they're doing is taking a starving population and drawing them to these poorly run, hyper-militarized, dystopian concentration camp-like aid distribution hubs, and then they're being shot by the Israeli military. It's like a shooting gallery. Yesterday, 56 people were killed trying to get aid at one of the aid distribution hubs. This is something we've really never seen before, where aid is being weaponized to the point where it's killing hundreds of people a week. And so the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, there should be efforts to prosecute their directors. And when you look at who actually founded this, these were there were some heavyweight humanitarian aid hucksters involved, including the former CEO of Jose Andres' World Central Kitchen, Nate Mook. His name was on the founding documents. He pulled out because he saw what was coming, but these figures haven't gotten any scrutiny. Um, where's the end game for Gaza? Where is this going? If Iran is able to actually turn the screws on Israel, I don't know if that's possible. They may be able to force a ceasefire. And right now, I think they're the only force on the planet capable of doing it because there's no will from the US administration. There's no will from Europe, the EU. They're just allowing the Holocaust of our time to take place right in front of our eyes. And, it's that Holocaust regime in Tel Aviv that Donald Trump now refers to as we. And Senator Ted Cruz, in an interview with Tucker Carlson, where he was just intellectually dismantled, referred to them as we. That's where we're at with our leadership. And I think everyone watching this is just sort of overcome with outrage, but we can't let it sap our energy.
Thank you, Max. Thank you also for mentioning that about the Jewish community in Iran. I imagine a lot of people would be surprised to know that there's a vibrant Jewish community in Iran. So thanks again for mentioning that. I'll give you the floor now for any closing remarks. And also, could you share with people where they can find more of your work?
Well, I think everyone here can find me on social media just by name. But if you would like to follow us more closely, subscribe to the Gray Zone. Subscribe to our newsletter at our site, thegrayzone.com. Subscribe to us on Substack. You'll get our articles and videos every day. Subscribe to us on YouTube. You'll keep up with our weekly live streams. And we're on, well, I'll hope to come back in person to the community church, hopefully when this Holocaust is over, to assess the damage and talk about a way forward. But in the meantime, I think we all need to get ready to be out in the streets and protest what looks like a coming disaster on the watch of Donald Trump, who has been instrumentalized by apartheid warlord Benjamin Netanyahu. A truly disgraceful decision could be coming down at any minute that will unleash a catastrophe that will define our world for a generation. And so we need to be out in the streets, and there just hasn't been enough protest. There hasn't been enough from the anti-war community, from the left. And I'll do everything I can to be a part of it. So thanks a lot for being here, and thanks Amara again for hosting me. I pretty much have nothing left to say.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us again. Max, we look forward to having you back in Boston, inshallah. So thank